Okay, I'd like to start off our class. Now that we've looked at what sustainability is and how it can be approached by looking at through the ancient world, looking at our first example. And I thought I would start off with Easter Island because it's a fascinating example of what can happen when people misuse their environment. Now, I'm sure many of you have probably heard of Easter Island. It's the famous island with the large carved heads. I know when I was growing up, it was one of those mysteries, like who built the Easter Island heads, and of course, all sorts of different explanations. But you hardly ever heard that the native people who were living on that island actually built them, and that was true. However, it is a really good example for this class on what I've called an ecological collapse, where what happened is that people misused the land, whether intentionally or not, and it caused a collapse of their civilization on the island. Now, there's lots of things to think about, but first we need to think about why are we starting here? Like I could have started off in ancient Greece or Egypt or the Mayans. Um, well, there's a number of reasons. One is that, for lack of a better term, something called ecocide. So the killing of their ecology. Um, I put in here it probably wasn't intentional, so it would be second-degree murder, but this is what happened. So the ecology sort of fell apart because of some of their environmental practices that they were using. Genocide is another possible reason why we start here. So genocide is the murder of an entire people. In this case, this could be disease introduced after European contact. We also know that there were raiders from Peru who were looking for people, so slave raiding. I will tell you as I go through this list, there are lots of explanations for all of this given by lots of different people. So what I've done is I've gone through and tried to pick what I thought were the best examples of what could explain what was happening in Easter Island. There's also something called the slow demise theory, which is a mix of both. So you've got the killing of the environment, plus then you've got European contact bringing all the diseases to people who hadn't been exposed to that. And then with the slave raiders from Peru decimating the population even more. Now, there are other reasons to look here, and this is one of the reasons why I picked this, because it really is a good case study on what can happen to an environment. So the first thing here, I put not what happened, but what did happen. So we know from lots of different studies that something really terrible happened in their ecosystem, and the people who were living there really suffered for it. Easter Island is an island, and it just so happens that when their ecology got so bad, they couldn't leave the island because they had no wood to build boats. So it gives us a very defined area and a small amount of data. We don't have a whole continent to go over. Another reason is that the interconnectedness between what people did and their environment is relatively clear. I say relatively because there's always new information coming out, but best case guess right now is that it's pretty clear that humans had a devastating impact on Easter Island. Another reason why I wanted to start us off here is it's interdisciplinary, meaning we're not just talking about the history of the island, like what happened and when it happened. We're going to be looking at the science of what happened. So there's lots of different studies, and I give you some of the readings of the syllabus on what's happening in Easter Island. So some of these are using pollen, for example, pollen counts, which can tell us the different type of plants and so on. So there's lots of things. There's anthropology we can look at for what's happening in these human communities. So it's a really good case study. Okay, so where is Easter Island? Let me see if I can get my little marker to work here. So here you've got Easter Island. Here you've got Chile. And you've got a scale here. So this is probably about 2,000 miles away from Chile. So it was first populated, as far as we can know, around 450 CE. So CE, I'll talk about dates in just a bit. CE is Common Era. So 450 AD is exactly the same. Now there are debates about when the island was first inhabited by people, and we'll see this to be the case throughout this course. There's lots of different ways to interpret things. It's possible that 40 to 100 people arrived on the island, probably from the Polynesian islands, coming in by their boats. Now, by about 1500 CE, or the Common Era, or AD, we've got maybe 10,000 people living on the island now, with quite an interesting civilization that they built. We know that Europeans arrived in 1722 because we've got written records, and then we've got the slave raiders coming a little bit later in 1862, 1863, and taking people away from the island. So what kind of culture did they have? So I mentioned at the very beginning, Easter Island is famous because of these large statues. And at the very beginning slide, I think it was the first slide, I had an image of some of these statues. These things are pretty massive. 82 tons, 15 to 30 feet tall. I think 30 feet tall is probably the tallest. And then they were moved up to 5 miles. Now you have to think about what it takes for a group of people to create something like that. It's not like it's just 30 people who don't know each other that just decide to do these things. This is a pretty stratified civilization, meaning they probably had leaders, they had people who were working, and then working for a common goal. It was probably a religious goal. But you have to have farmers to feed these people and so on. So when you think about these statues or other, what might be called monumental architecture, think about what it takes to actually build something like this. Now here's where some of the science comes in. So we've got pollen studies. So what they've done with these pollen studies, they've taken cross sections of the land and then looked at the various layers, and then they've counted pollen. One thing that shows up is that before people arrived, there was a vast palm forest. And I've given you the page that I'm referring to. The article is listed in the syllabus by foot. And this is a different type of palm. These palms were very tall. And so the people who arrived there could actually build things with them. So they would use the wood. Its palm really isn't a wood. It's sort of, a grass, but we'll call it wood for right now. But they could build houses out of it. They could build boats. And of course, when you've got houses, you need heat. So they burned the wood for heat. Birds and different types of animals lived in these palms. And then you could also eat the nuts and eat the sap. So this is what people arrived to, this beautiful, lush land. Now, when you look at the pollen studies from the later part of this cut that people took from, or this side cut, when you're looking at the land, around 1400, you see a reduction in the palm pollen. And then you see an increase in grass pollen. What that's telling us is that they're cutting down the palm trees, and so you get less pollen from the palm trees, and you get an increase in grass. So what's happening is that the palm trees are being used, the land is maybe bare, we're not quite sure yet, and grasses are growing up in their place. So then these grasses give off pollen, so you get more pollen because of the grass and less pollen because you have fewer palm trees. Now, of course, when you cut all these palm trees down, and it looks like they cut almost every single one down, you get a loss of habitat. So loss of birds, and people can eat birds. Birds do lots of other things. They drop manure, and which keeps the soil fertile, and so on. And they eat insects and so on. So you have a loss of the native habitat, and there's evidence that they became dependent on chickens for food, which were domesticated. So you lose the trees, you lose the birds, you lose a food source, you lose whole food chains, and they became dependent on chickens. Now, another place that science has showed us is really interesting in archaeology are garbage dumps. And this is the case all over the ancient world and in the modern world, by the way. It showed that in these garbage dumps, you find large amounts of porpoise bones. So porpoise are deep water animals, and you have to have boats to go fishing to catch them. So they could build boats before 1500. Now, after 1500, you see a definite decrease in the number of porpoise bones. So what this means is they're not going out to fish to get the porpoises anymore, probably because they can't. They've cut down the trees. So they have no more trees to build boats. They can't go deep water fishing. So it's interesting where you can get information from and sort of recreate some of the issues that they were having. Now we also have eyewitness sources that come later. Now these are the Europeans arriving in the 1700s. They describe what Easter Island looked like then. So people living in huts. They were fighting with each other. Different groups were fighting with each other. There was cannibalism, little to no trees, and then living off whatever agriculture they could have. Now, you have to be careful with these eyewitnesses. So if you've had other history classes or just sort of a basic knowledge of history, you have to be careful with one group talking about another, especially when you've got the case of the Europeans who consider themselves to be superior to other people. Different cultures that were looked at by the Europeans were seen very differently. They were always lower on the social ladder than the Europeans. So we just have to be careful with these sources, but it's what they tell us. So we've got those. Now, what probably happened is what I just sort of talked about. And I know I've got a lot on this slide. I won't go through every single point, but you can certainly pause the video and read through it. As I mentioned, people made use of these palm trees. So we use pollen studies to figure out that they really chopped them down. The loss of those trees meant a loss of other things for the people who were living there. Wood for houses, wood for heating, food. Now, they did clear out the space when they cut these trees down for agriculture. So they grew sweet potatoes. Now, when you grow food, your population almost naturally increases. Now, what that means is, as your population is increasing, you need to plant more. So you chop down more trees or clear more land, plant more food, your population increases, but then you get to the point where there's no more land, especially on an island. So when there's no more land, your population starts to decrease, especially, and we know this happened, you get erosion. So when they cut down these palm trees for wood, say, and didn't plant anything else, it could rain heavily, and if they're on hills, you'd get massive amounts of erosion of the soil that was naturally there and had built up for a very long time. This all gets swept away, meaning the soil is not as fertile as it was. It also leads to issues downslope, where you get flooding, possibly flooding, and we'll look at that in other civilizations. So with the soil reduction, of the soil fertility reduction, you get a decrease in the population because the soil can't produce as much food. And then as they're in their heyday, where they're chopping down these trees, but they're growing lots of food and the population is high, they could build these statues. So they started building these. Now, we know that these statues were moved by putting them on logs. So they made the statues, they put them down on logs, and then rolled the statues away. You don't get the logs anymore, you can't move your statues. And of course, when you don't have wood, you can't build boats. So they couldn't go fishing, they couldn't even leave the island. So they devastated their environment, and then they were sort of stuck there. And then Europeans arrived, and then people from Peru arrived. So I've got the same thing here. I'm not going to go through all of these steps. You can look at this later. Sorry, the arrows are not very nice and clear. I just sort of put this together and then tried to use the drawing. But essentially, it's what I just told you. They use the trees, the population increases, it leads to overforestation, decrease in the amount of wood, decrease in fertility, and then the population goes down. Okay, so other things that probably affected what was happening on Easter Island, of course, is the Europeans, bringing European diseases like what happened in North, Central, and South America. Same thing happened here. People were exposed to new things, and that probably led to some population decline. And then I've talked about the people who came and enslaved people, took them back to the mainland, and then you're left with whatever population you had there in the late 1800s. Okay, so I just told you a quick and dirty story about Easter Island. Now, how can we use this? How can we use Easter Island as an example? A few things to remember. Now, this will be different than when we start looking at, say, Egypt or Greece or Rome or the Mayans or the Aztecs. this is almost a closed system. They're on an island. They can't get off the island. So whatever happens to them before outside people came, they can't leave. And it is an extreme example, but it does show you pretty clearly what can happen when you do something, maybe on accident, you cut down all the trees, you get massive amounts of soil erosion, and you are stuck. But it's a really good example. As I mentioned, the other places we're going to look at, they're not closed systems, but you still see some of the same patterns where people move into an area, or they're there, they start learning agriculture, they clear the trees away, they clear the native brush, soil erosion, it causes other issues. So we'll see similar patterns throughout this course. And then we really have to think about what are the lessons for today. So we all know that the Earth is in pretty poor shape right now with climate change, almost certainly man-made. We have lots of soil degradation issues. And so I'm not really going to answer these questions for you, but it's something I really want you to think about, because what happened in Easter Island, even though it's a closed system on an island, can certainly be seen to replicate in other places. So what are the lessons for today? Like, what should we be doing that the ancient Easter Islanders did that we shouldn't be doing today? And then, another thing to think about, and we didn't really talk about this yet, is, is it appropriate to look for lessons from history? And I think it certainly is. There's no point in looking at history if you're not going to use it in some way. Now, there are other views by other historians on what history is and how it should be used and so on, but I don't see the point of learning about history if you can't apply something to current day.